I was standing in my son's living room when my daughter-in-law lifted her phone, smiled into the screen, and decided that I was going to be her content. At the time, it felt like nothing more than another small irritation. The room was warm, crowded with family. The low hum of conversation drifting above the clink of glasses. I was leaning slightly against the back of a chair, my hands folded in front of me, wearing the same brown sweater I had owned for years. The same worn shoes that had carried me through 1,000 ordinary days. I had no reason to think I was about to become a spectacle. She didn't ask me anything. She didn't warn me. She just pointed the camera in my direction and laughed. "This is my father-in-law," she said brightly, her voice sweet in that practiced way people use online. "Look at him, the poor old man of the family." People in the room chuckled, uncertain whether they were allowed to laugh. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I didn't object. I simply stood there, watching my own reflection in the black glass of her phone. By the time I sat down that night in my quiet house, the video had already crossed a line I didn't yet understand. By morning, 5 million strangers had watched my daughter-in-law mock my clothes, my age, my existence. 5 million people decided who I was based on 30 seconds of footage. What hurt most came later, after I made a call I never thought I would have to make. And what they didn't know was that while they were laughing, I had already set something in motion. 3 days later, everything they relied on began to unravel. The gathering itself had been unremarkable, a casual family get-together, nothing formal, nothing planned. I had arrived early, as I usually did, carrying a small bag of groceries because I don't like showing up empty-handed. My son barely noticed. He was busy helping his wife adjust the lighting near the window, angling furniture so the room would look better on camera. She was always filming. Meals, conversations, holidays, quiet moments that were never meant for strangers. I had learned to stay out of her frame when I could, to step aside when the phone came up. I believed, foolishly, that family spaces still held some boundaries. That night I was tired. I had spent the afternoon driving my old car across town, running errands, doing the things a man my age does without complaint. I sat when I needed to sit. I stood when I needed to stand. I wasn't thinking about how I looked. She was. When she started narrating, I felt it before I understood it. That sensation when the air in a room changes, when people stop talking and start watching. I remember the way her eyes flicked from the phone screen to me and back again, checking her angle, checking her performance. "He still wears sweaters like this," she continued, laughing softly. "And don't even get me started on his car. I mean, bless his heart, but it's embarrassing." Someone laughed too loudly. Someone else looked away. My son didn't say a word. I wish I could tell you I felt angry, that I felt humiliated in the moment. The truth is more unsettling. I felt strangely calm, as if my body understood something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. I had lived long enough to recognize cruelty when I saw it. And I had learned that reacting immediately often gives cruel people exactly what they want. So I stayed quiet. She lowered the phone, eventually satisfied. The room resumed its noise. Plates were passed. Drinks were refilled. Life went on. No one apologized. No one checked on me. No one asked if I was all right. When I drove home later that night, the streets were empty. My headlights cut through the dark, and the radio hummed softly. I remember thinking about how peaceful everything felt once the noise was gone. I had no idea the noise was only beginning. My phone started vibrating before I even set my keys down. Messages from distant relatives, missed calls from people I hadn't spoken to in years, notifications from platforms I barely used. Confused, I sat at my kitchen table and opened the link someone had sent. There I was, standing in that living room, frozen in time, her words replaying over and over again, the view count ticking upward so fast it made my stomach tighten. Hundreds of comments at first, then thousands. People laughed at my sweater, my shoes, my posture, my age. They speculated about my finances, my usefulness, my worth. They called me a burden, a freeloader. a sad old man who didn't know his place. I read far more than I should have, not because I believed them, but because I needed to understand the scale of it. I needed to see what my family had allowed to happen. By morning, the video had crossed 5 million views. 5 million people had judged me without knowing my name, my history, or the woman whose glasses I still wore, because they reminded me of her. What unsettled me most wasn't the cruelty of strangers. Opinion has always been cheap. What unsettled me was the realization that someone I trusted had handed them permission. As the day went on, my daughter-in-law posted again, responding to comments, laughing, encouraging the jokes, pinning the cruelest remarks to the top because they performed better. My humiliation had become her strategy. I watched quietly. I noticed something I hadn't seen before in the original video. In the background, just behind her shoulder, my son stood near the kitchen counter, arms crossed, expression neutral. He didn't smile. He didn't intervene. He didn't ask her to stop filming. He just watched. That was when the embarrassment shifted into something colder. I had spent years believing that patience was a virtue, that silence preserved peace, that enduring small slights was part of being a father, part of growing older with grace. I had told myself that love meant letting things go. But watching my son stand there, allowing his wife to turn his father into a joke for millions, I felt something break that had nothing to do with pride. That night, I sat alone in my living room, the house quiet except for the ticking of the clock. I thought about calling her. I dismissed the idea immediately. I thought about responding publicly, about explaining myself, about correcting the record. None of it felt right. This wasn't about strangers misunderstanding me. This was about family choosing comfort over respect. So I did what I should have done sooner. I picked up my phone and called my son. I wasn't angry when I dialed. I wasn't shaking. I didn't plan a speech. I simply believed deep down that a father should be able to expect protection from his own child. I thought this call would end the video. I didn't know it would end something else entirely. The morning after the video went viral, I woke up before sunrise the way I often did these days. The house was quiet, still holding the night in its corners. No notifications chimed. No laughter echoed. Just the low hum of the refrigerator and the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. I sat at the small kitchen table with a cup of coffee and stared out the window as the sky slowly lightened. It struck me then how strange it was that 5 million people were laughing at me, while my world looked exactly the same as it had the day before. Same curtains, same chipped mug, same chair with the loose leg I kept meaning to fix. Nothing about my life suggested tragedy. Nothing about it suggested wealth either. And that, I realized, was the problem. To people who didn't know me, I must have looked exactly like what my daughter-in-law said I was. An old man clinging to outdated clothes. A father-in-law who didn't fit the picture of success she wanted to project online. Someone easy to reduce to a punchline. I had lived like this by choice. I drove an old car because it ran perfectly fine and didn't demand attention. I wore sweaters until they softened with age because they were comfortable and familiar. I shopped with a list, not an impulse. I fixed things instead of replacing them. I had stopped trying to impress anyone a long time ago, especially after my wife died. When Eleanor was still alive, our life had been fuller, louder, warmer. Not extravagant, but intentional. We hosted dinners not for show, but because we liked watching people eat and talk and relax around our table. When she got sick, that table became quieter. When she passed, it became a place I sometimes avoided altogether. Grief has a way of stripping life down to essentials. It teaches you what matters when performance no longer feels necessary. After Eleanor was gone, I learned how little I needed to keep going. How little of myself I was willing to offer to people who didn't truly see me. I kept her reading glasses on the side table near the couch. I wore them when my eyes were tired, even though my prescription had changed. They were scratched and slightly crooked. but they fit my face the way they always had. Wearing them made me feel closer to her, as if some quiet part of her was still paying attention. Those glasses were the ones my daughter-in-law had laughed at. As I sat there that morning, scrolling through the comments I should have stopped reading, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't ashamed of how I lived. I wasn't embarrassed by my car or my clothes or my house. What I felt was something closer to disappointment. My family had seen my life up close. They had sat at my table. They had watched me show up consistently, quietly, without fanfare. And yet somewhere along the way, they had decided that simplicity meant lack, that quiet meant absence, that humility meant weakness. They had misunderstood me, and I had helped them do it. Over the years, there had been moments I dismissed too easily. Little comments disguised as jokes, suggestions that I could upgrade my wardrobe, casual remarks about how small my house was compared to theirs. I told myself it was generational, that younger people saw the world differently, that it wasn't worth correcting. When my son married her, I told myself the adjustment period would pass. She was young, ambitious, hungry for attention. Social media rewarded extremes, not nuance. I believed maturity would soften her edges. Instead, it sharpened them. At family dinners, she often spoke over me, redirecting conversations toward topics that photographed well. She asked questions not to listen, but to set up stories she could later tell online. I noticed how often my son deferred to her, how quickly he adapted his opinions to match hers. I watched it happen in small, almost invisible ways. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere, that my role now was to be supportive, not corrective, that fathers who demanded respect became lonely men. Silence felt safer. That morning, sitting alone with the weight of 5 million strangers' laughter pressing against my chest, I wondered when patience had crossed the line into permission, when my refusal to speak had taught my family that my dignity was negotiable. I thought about the last real conversation Eleanor and I had about family. It was during one of her better weeks, when the pain meds were working and her voice was steady. We were sitting on the couch, the windows open, the late afternoon light filling the room. She had looked at me then and said something I didn't want to hear. "If we don't set boundaries now," she said softly, "they'll think love means unlimited access." I argued with her, told her we didn't need rules, that our son was good-hearted, that family should be built on trust, not conditions. She had smiled in that tired way she did near the end. Not unkindly, just knowingly. "Trust doesn't mean silence," she said, "and love doesn't survive entitlement." I remembered brushing it off, promising myself I would deal with problems if they ever became real. Now, watching strangers mock the man Eleanor had loved for decades, I realized how late I was to that conversation. By midday, my phone buzzed again. Not a message of concern, not an apology. Another notification: my daughter-in-law had posted a follow-up video. This one ranking family members by success, her words, not mine. My name sat neatly at the bottom. I didn't watch it all the way through. Instead, I set my phone down and stood by the window watching a neighbor walk his dog. Ordinary life continued. People went to work. Children waited for buses. Somewhere, someone was burning toast and cursing under their breath. The world hadn't ended because I was mocked. It wouldn't end because I stayed quiet. But something in me understood that doing nothing now would shape what came next. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want sympathy. I didn't want to expose myself to people who had already decided I wasn't worth respecting. What I wanted was simpler and harder. I wanted my son to remember who raised him. That afternoon, I replayed the original video one more time, not to read the comments, not to analyze her words. I watched only the background, the way my son stood there, arms crossed, watching his wife speak, the way he didn't step forward, didn't interrupt, didn't even look uncomfortable. Silence isn't neutral. It takes a side. As the sun began to set, I picked up my phone again. I didn't hesitate this time. I didn't rehearse. I didn't plan what I would say beyond the truth. I wasn't calling to scold him. I wasn't calling to demand loyalty. I wasn't calling to explain myself. I was calling to find out if I still had a place in my own family. I pressed his name and waited for the line to connect, believing despite everything that this conversation would set things right. I didn't yet understand that some calls don't fix what's broken. They reveal it. By the time my son answered the phone, 5 million strangers had already decided who I was. The number felt unreal. I had lived 70 years meeting people one by one, shaking hands, learning names, building trust slowly. Now, a crowd larger than any stadium had looked at a short clip of me standing silently in a living room and concluded I was a joke, a burden, someone safe to ridicule because I didn't fight back. I didn't call my son right away. I needed to understand what had happened before I spoke. I needed to know whether this was a moment that had spiraled out of control or something more deliberate. I sat in my chair and watched the video again, this time without sound. Without the laughter, without her voice guiding the narrative, the scene looked different. A man standing still. A woman animated, confident, performing. A group of people hovering in the background, uncertain, uncomfortable. And my son just behind her shoulder, watching it all unfold. I hadn't noticed his posture the first time. The way his arms were folded, not defensively, but casually. The way he leaned against the counter, not intervening, not stepping forward, not even shifting his weight, as if he considered stopping it. He wasn't frozen. He was passive. That distinction mattered. As the hours passed, the comments became more vicious. It wasn't just about clothes anymore. It was about worth. People speculated about whether I contributed anything to the family, whether I lived off my son, whether I was a burden everyone secretly resented. Strangers felt entitled to strip me down to whatever story entertained them most. I recognized something in myself as I read. Not anger, not humiliation, distance. There is a point when cruelty becomes so exaggerated that it stops feeling personal. It becomes noise. What stayed personal was the knowledge that someone close to me had opened the door and invited the noise in. My daughter-in-law posted again that afternoon. Another video. This time she smiled into the camera and said people were being too sensitive. That humor didn't have an age limit. That if someone couldn't take a joke, maybe they needed thicker skin. She laughed as she said it. The comments applauded her. They praised her honesty. They encouraged her to keep going. I watched her scroll tap pin remarks that were crueler than anything she had said herself. She didn't need to insult me anymore. She let the internet do it for her. That was when I understood it wasn't an accident. This wasn't a careless joke that went too far. This was a performance built on my humiliation. A strategy. A choice. I wondered how long she had been waiting for an opportunity like this. How often she had looked at me and seen content instead of a person. How easily she had turned a family moment into a spectacle without a second thought. And still my son said nothing. I imagined what it must have looked like from his side. A viral moment. His wife gaining attention, people laughing, engagement skyrocketing, the kind of visibility that social media treats as currency. Perhaps he told himself it was harmless, that it would pass, that it wasn't worth creating conflict over a few jokes. Perhaps he told himself I didn't mind. That assumption hurt more than anything else. I'd spent years being careful not to demand too much from him, not to burden him with my expectations, not to become the kind of father who needed reassurance at every turn. I wanted him to live his life freely. I wanted him to feel proud, not obligated. But watching him stand silently while his wife turned me into a joke made me realize how thoroughly I had erased myself from his calculations. As evening fell, I turned my phone face down and sat in the quiet again. The house felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were listening. I thought about how easily people confuse dignity with weakness, How often silence is interpreted as permission. I considered responding publicly. I imagined typing a calm explanation, correcting assumptions, setting the record straight. I imagined revealing who I really was, what I had built, what I had contributed quietly over decades. The thought left a sour taste in my mouth. I didn't want validation from strangers who had already decided my worth based on appearances. I didn't want to win an argument against millions of people who would move on to the next spectacle tomorrow. What I wanted was accountability from the people who mattered. So I picked up my phone and scrolled to my son's name. I paused there longer than I expected. Not because I was afraid of the conversation, but because I was afraid of what it might reveal. I still believed stubbornly that he would defend me once he understood how far things had gone. I believed that family at its core meant protection. I pressed call. It rang twice before he answered. "Hey, Dad," he said, his voice casual, distracted. I could hear music in the background, laughter, life continuing uninterrupted. I closed my eyes briefly, steadying myself. "We need to talk," I said. There was a pause, a subtle shift in his tone. "Yeah, sure. What's going on?" I took a breath. I chose my words carefully. I didn't accuse. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't mention money or reputation or pride. "I saw the video," I said, "and the comments. It's gone further than you might think." He sighed, the sound familiar from years of conversations where he believed I was overthinking something. "Dad, it's just social media. People don't take that stuff seriously." 5 million people watched it, I said quietly. "They're still watching." "It's a joke," he replied. "That's how her audience works. You know, she didn't mean anything by it." I waited, hoping he would hear himself, hoping he would stop and reconsider. "She's still posting," I said. "She's encouraging it. People are laughing at me, son. Strangers, people who don't know me." Another pause, shorter this time. "You kinda look like you can't afford better," he said. "I mean, you dress simple. You drive that old car. Can you really blame her for thinking that?" The words landed with a dull finality. Can you really blame her for thinking that? In that moment, something shifted inside me that I knew would never shift back. It wasn't rage. It wasn't heartbreak. It was clarity. He wasn't defending his wife out of confusion. He was defending her because he agreed with her. He believed the mockery made sense. He believed my appearance justified my humiliation. I didn't argue. I didn't list my reasons. I didn't explain my choices. "Thank you for being honest," I said. He hesitated, perhaps sensing the change in my voice. "Dad, I didn't mean it like that. You're just taking this too personally." I almost laughed at that. Almost. "I'm going to hang up now," I said instead. "Wait," he said. "We can talk about this." "We just did," I replied. I ended the call. The silence afterward was complete. No ringing in my ears. No racing thoughts. Just the quiet certainty that something fundamental had been exposed. I sat there for a long time, staring at my darkened phone. I thought about every moment I had stayed quiet to keep the peace. Every time I had swallowed a comment dismissed, a slight told myself it wasn't worth addressing. All of it had led here. That night I didn't sleep much. Not because I was restless, but because my mind was working through a conclusion it had reached without my permission. I had given my son every opportunity to choose differently. I had believed patience would teach him respect. I understood now that patience without boundaries teaches something else entirely. And for the first time since the video went viral, I stopped wondering whether I should respond. I knew exactly what I needed to do next. I sat in the quiet for a long time after the call ended, the phone resting face down on the table, like it had betrayed me too. The house hadn't changed. The walls didn't close in. The clock didn't stop ticking. But something fundamental had shifted, something I knew I wouldn't be able to talk myself out of later. For years I had told myself that time would soften things, that patience would lead people back to decency. In one short conversation, that belief collapsed. I replayed my son's words in my head, not because they shocked me, but because of how easily they came to him. He hadn't struggled to justify the mockery. He hadn't sounded conflicted. He had said it the way people say something they've already decided is true. Can you really blame her for thinking that it wasn't the cruelty of the sentence that hurt most? It was the logic behind it. The quiet agreement. The idea that my worth was open to interpretation based on how I looked. That I had earned ridicule by choosing simplicity. I had raised him better than that. Or at least I thought I had. I stood up and walked through the house, turning lights on and off without realizing it. I passed the small bookshelf where Eleanor's favorite novels still sat untouched. I paused at the side table and picked up her reading glasses, running my thumb over the worn frame. She would have heard his words differently than I did. Where I heard dismissal, she would have heard a warning. I remembered how she used to look at me when our son was younger, when he brushed off responsibility or made excuses for behavior that didn't sit right. She never scolded. She never raised her voice. She would simply ask one question and wait. What are you teaching him by letting that go? At the time, I always had an answer. He's young, he'll learn. It's not a big deal. Tonight, I had no answers left. I returned to the kitchen and sat down again, my hands folded, my breathing steady. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel vindictive. I felt something colder and more precise. I felt finished waiting. For the first time since the video appeared, I stopped thinking about how to fix the situation and started thinking about how to respond to what it revealed. Not to the internet, not to my daughter-in-law's audience. To the truth of who my family had become when they thought I wasn't paying attention. I thought about calling my daughter-in-law directly. I dismissed it almost immediately. Anything I said would be framed as sensitivity, weakness, or overreaction. She thrived on conflict she could package and post. Speaking to her would only give her more material. I thought about explaining myself to my son, about listing the reasons I lived the way I did, about correcting his assumptions and reminding him of everything I had quietly done for him over the years. That too felt pointless. If respect needed justification, it was already gone. I realized then that what hurt most wasn't the video or the comments or even my son's words. It was the clarity that followed them. The understanding that silence had allowed this version of reality to grow unchecked. That by avoiding discomfort for so long, I had helped create a space where my dignity could be negotiated. I didn't want to negotiate anymore. The decision didn't come with a rush of adrenaline or a dramatic sense of purpose. It arrived the way real decisions often do, quietly, without ceremony. I knew what I had to do, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted alignment between what I believed and what I allowed. I reached for my phone again, not to scroll, not to read, but to look at a name I hadn't touched in years. I hesitated just for a moment. This call was different from the one I had just made. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't reactive. It was procedural. It existed because of conversations Eleanor and I had shared long before any of this happened. Conversations I had hoped would remain theoretical. She had been the practical one, the one who thought ahead, the one who believed that loving people meant preparing for the day they might disappoint you. We need safeguards, she had said once, years ago during a quiet evening at home. Not because we don't trust him, because we trust ourselves to see clearly. I had resisted then. I didn't want to imagine a future where our son would choose comfort over character, where respect would be conditional, where we would need boundaries strong enough to hold under pressure. Now, sitting alone with my phone in my hand, I understood why she had insisted. I placed the call. It rang once before being answered. Yes, the voice on the other end said, professional, measured. It's Elias, I replied. There was a brief pause, then recognition. I was wondering when I'd hear from you. I need to activate what we discussed, I said. No questions followed. No surprise. just a calm acknowledgement. "All right," he said. "I'll begin immediately." That was it. No speeches, no explanations, no anger. The call lasted less than a minute. When I ended it, I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes. My hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of finality. Once set in motion, this couldn't be undone with apologies or excuses. It wouldn't respond to public opinion or emotional pleas. That was the point. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. Sad, even. This wasn't how I had imagined protecting my family. This wasn't how I had imagined teaching my son about respect. But imagining things differently didn't change reality. I spent the rest of the night in silence. I didn't watch the video again. I didn't check the comments. I didn't reach out to anyone. I made myself a simple dinner, washed the dishes, and sat in the living room with the lights low. At some point, I realized something that surprised me. The humiliation had stopped hurting. Not because it no longer existed, but because it no longer mattered. What mattered now was alignment. Between my values and my actions. Between the man Eleanor believed in and the man I needed to be. As I prepared for bed, I glanced at the calendar on the wall. 3 days stood between this moment and the first real consequence of the call I had just made. 3 days during which my family would continue laughing, posting, pretending nothing had changed. They wouldn't feel it yet. Not immediately. Consequences rarely announce themselves. I lay down that night and stared at the ceiling, listening to the house settle. I thought about my son, about the boy he had been, about the man he had become. I thought about my daughter-in-law and the world she lived in, where attention mattered more than decency. I didn't wish them harm. I wished them clarity. And as sleep finally took me, I understood something with a certainty that brought no comfort at all. The call I had just made wasn't about punishment. It was about drawing a line I should have drawn years ago. And by the time they realized where that line was, it would already be too late to step back over it. The house felt different the morning after I made the call. Though nothing in it had changed, the same chair waited by the window. The same light filtered through the curtains. The same quiet settled into the corners of the rooms. But the waiting was gone. The long, exhausting pause I had lived inside for years had finally ended. I moved through my routine slowly, deliberately. I made coffee. I washed the mug when I was done. I folded yesterday's sweater and placed it on the back of the chair instead of leaving it where it had fallen. Small actions, grounded actions. The kind you take when you want to stay present. I didn't check my phone right away. For the first time since the video went viral, I wasn't curious about what people were saying. The internet could shout into the void all it wanted. I had already stopped listening. Whatever came next would not arrive through comments or likes. It would arrive quietly. I thought again about all the ways I could have handled this differently. I could have called a family meeting. I could have demanded an apology. I could have gone public myself, explaining who I was, correcting assumptions, reclaiming my image. But none of that would have addressed the real issue. This wasn't about reputation. It was about values. Reputation can be repaired with words. Values are revealed through behavior. And behavior only changes when consequences exist. I understood that now, with painful clarity. The call I had made the night before hadn't been fueled by anger. It had been fueled by something colder and steadier. A refusal to keep participating in a version of family that required my dignity as collateral. I had thought about Eleanor a lot that morning. She would have hated what happened. Not because of the embarrassment, but because of the entitlement behind it. She had little tolerance for cruelty dressed up as humor. She believed jokes revealed more truth than confessions ever did. She also believed in preparation. Years ago, before her health declined, we had sat together at the dining table one evening, paperwork spread out between us. It wasn't a romantic conversation. It wasn't dramatic. It was practical. The kind of conversation people avoid because it forces them to imagine uncomfortable futures. We need to think about what happens if things don't go the way we expect, she had said. I argued with her, of course. I told her our son was good, that we had raised him right, that love didn't need conditions. She listened patiently, then met my eyes. Love doesn't need conditions, she said, but access does. I hadn't wanted to hear that. She talked about values then, about respect, about the difference between supporting someone and enabling them. She talked about how money, influence, and comfort can erode character when they're never challenged. We should build safeguards, she said. Not to punish anyone, to protect what matters. I remember agreeing in theory while hoping I would never need to act on it. I wanted to believe that example alone would be enough. That quiet integrity would speak louder than confrontation. It hadn't. That was the truth I was finally accepting. The call I made last night existed because of those conversations. Because of decisions we made together years before the video, years before the mockery. Decisions rooted in foresight, not suspicion. In love, not fear. I hadn't activated anything new. I had simply stopped delaying something that already existed. By mid-morning, my phone buzzed. A short message. Neutral language. No emotion, no details. Underway. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then set the phone down again. There was nothing to respond to, nothing to ask. The machinery didn't require my supervision. That, I realized, was another reason Eleanor had insisted on building things this way. True accountability shouldn't depend on someone's mood or second thoughts. It should function even when emotions waver. And mine did waver. As the day went on, doubt crept in around the edges. Not about whether my son had crossed a line. That was undeniable. But about the scale of what I had set in motion. I knew consequences were coming. I didn't yet know how they would land. I questioned myself in the quiet moments. Was this too harsh? Had I waited too long? Would this destroy something that could have been repaired with time and humility? I thought again of the call with my son, of his voice, of how easily he had agreed with the mockery, how quickly he had rationalized it. I reminded myself that I hadn't chosen this outcome. I had responded to it. By the afternoon, my daughter-in-law posted again. I saw it, not because I was looking, but because someone sent it to me. A video about haters, about people who couldn't take a joke, about how the internet was full of overly sensitive individuals who needed to relax. Her smile looked forced this time. Her eyes flicked toward the screen as if checking numbers. The comments were still supportive, but the tone had shifted. Less laughter, more defense. She could feel something changing. She just didn't know what. That night, I slept better than I had in days, not because I felt relieved, but because my mind was no longer circling the same questions. The decision had been made. The path was set. All that remained was time. The next morning came quietly. I woke, made coffee, read a few pages of a book Eleanor had loved. I lingered over sentences the way she used to rereading lines until they settled properly. Another message came late that afternoon, slightly longer this time. Still professional, still calm. Phase 1 complete. I felt my chest tighten just briefly, not with excitement, with gravity. Whatever Phase 1 meant, it wasn't symbolic. It was real, tangible. Somewhere, something my family relied on had shifted. And still, they laughed. My son didn't call. My daughter-in-law continued posting, though less frequently. Life from their perspective moved forward, uninterrupted. They had no idea they were standing on ground that was already giving way beneath their feet. That was the hardest part to accept. I wasn't watching for their discomfort. I wasn't tracking their anxiety. I wasn't waiting for panic to appear. I was waiting for understanding. And understanding, I knew, arrived last. On the third morning, I stood by the window and looked out at the street. A delivery truck passed. A neighbor waved. The world remained stubbornly ordinary. I checked the calendar again, counting the days since the call. 3 days. 3 days since patience ended and consequence began. My phone buzzed once more. Finalized. I closed my eyes and exhaled slowly. The weight of that single word settled into my bones. This was no longer a process. It was a fact. I knew then that whatever happened next, there would be no undoing it. Apologies wouldn't reverse it. Explanations wouldn't soften it. Public opinion wouldn't influence it. And for the first time, I understood why Eleanor had called this love. Not the gentle, permissive kind that avoids discomfort. The steady kind that insists on growth, even when it hurts. I looked again at my phone, then turned it face down. They were still laughing. I was already finished waiting. The first day after everything was finalized looked exactly like every other day. I woke before the alarm made my coffee and sat by the window as the neighborhood came to life. A woman jogged past with her headphones in. A man backed his truck out of the driveway across the street, waving absent-mindedly when he saw me. Ordinary life moved forward, unaware that anything had shifted. Inside me, though, there was no more waiting. That surprised me. I had expected nerves, anticipation, some restless urge to check my phone every few minutes. Instead, there was a steady calm, the kind that settles in after a decision has been made and accepted. I wasn't hoping for anything anymore. I wasn't bracing myself either. I was simply present. My daughter-in-law posted another video that morning. Someone forwarded it to me with a short message I didn't respond to. I watched just enough to understand the tone. She smiled, joked about critics called them sensitive, and reminded her followers that humor wasn't for everyone. She laughed, but it didn't sound the same. The confidence was still there, but it felt stretched thin like fabric pulled too tight. She checked the screen more often now, her eyes darting to the corner where the numbers appeared. Engagement mattered to her the way air mattered to the rest of us. An air I knew was starting to feel scarce. My son didn't call. That too felt familiar. For years I had been the one to reach out, the one to check in, the one to smooth over awkward silences and misunderstandings. Now the silence belonged to him, and for the first time I didn't rush to fill it. By late afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. Brief, polite, asking if I was aware of an unexpected delay related to something my son and his wife were involved in. I read it once, then again, then set the phone down without replying. I knew exactly what it was. The first crack had appeared. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't public. It didn't announce itself with accusations or demands. It arrived quietly, the way consequences usually do when they're real. A delay, a complication, a door that didn't open when it always had before. That evening, my son finally called. His voice sounded irritated, not worried. Annoyance came before fear. "Hey, Dad," he said. "Quick question. Do you know anything about why this thing we were counting on is suddenly stalled?" I listened carefully, not just to his words, but to what he avoided saying. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't mention the video. He didn't apologize. He assumed I might have information, influence, a connection. "I'm not sure," I said calmly. There was a pause, short, tense. "Well, it's strange," he continued. "It's never been an issue before." "Things change," I replied. Another pause, longer this time. "Yeah," he said. "I guess they do." We ended the call without resolution, without anger, without understanding. But something important had happened. For the first time, he wasn't speaking from a position of certainty. He was searching, and he didn't like it. The second day began much the same. I kept my routine simple. I went to the grocery store, nodded at the clerk, paid in cash, like I always did. Outside, I sat in my car for a moment longer than usual, watching people load bags into trunks, watching couples argue quietly over forgotten items. Life was messy and human and unfiltered. No cameras, no performances. When I got home, I checked my phone and saw that my daughter-in-law had deleted a recent post. No announcement, no explanation, just gone. I didn't feel satisfaction at the sight, only confirmation. She could feel the shift now. That afternoon, my son sent a short message, less casual than before, more direct. "Can we talk later?" I didn't answer right away. I spent the next hour walking through the house, touching familiar objects, grounding myself. The edge of the counter where Eleanor used to lean while she talked. The windowsill she always forgot to dust. The chair she claimed as her own, even when guests came over. I thought about how much of myself I had given quietly without conditions, because I believed love should be uncomplicated. I thought about how often that belief had been used against me. When I finally responded, I kept it brief. Later is fine. That conversation never happened. Something interrupted it. Something he didn't expect. By evening, my daughter-in-law's tone online had changed again. Less humor, more defensiveness. She posted a vague message about people turning on you when you least expect it, about loyalty, about how success attracts resentment. The comments were mixed now. Some still supported her, others questioned her. A few mentioned the video with me asking if it had gone too far. She didn't reply to those. I felt a pang then, sharp and unexpected. Not guilt, grief. This wasn't how I wanted my family to learn. I would have preferred quiet conversations, mutual understanding, growth that came from humility rather than loss. But wanting something doesn't make it real. Eleanor's voice returned to me that night, clear as it always was when I needed it most. Consequences teach what words cannot. The third day arrived with a heaviness I hadn't anticipated. I woke with the sense that something had completed itself even before I checked my phone. There was a final message waiting. Shorter than the others. Definitive. Done. I sat with that word for a long time. This was no longer a process unfolding. It was a fact. A new reality that would begin pressing in on the people who had laughed just days earlier. They wouldn't understand it yet. Not fully. Understanding always lagged behind impact. Late that morning, my son showed up at my door unannounced. He looked different. Not dramatically so, just slightly less sure of himself. His posture wasn't as relaxed. His eyes didn't scan the room with the same confidence. He stood on my porch, like a man who had walked into a situation he hadn't prepared for. "Hey," he said. "Come in," I replied. We sat across from each other in the living room, the space between us heavy with things neither of us had said. He talked first, words tumbling out faster than usual. "Things are getting complicated," he said. "Stuff we thought was solid isn't. And I don't understand why." I waited. He glanced at me, searching my face. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about this, would you?" I met his eyes calmly. "I know that choices have consequences," I said. His jaw tightened. "This feels extreme. It feels sudden," I corrected. "Those aren't the same thing." He didn't argue. He couldn't. Something in his expression shifted then, just slightly. The first hint of fear. That was the moment I understood something important. They hadn't been laughing because they believed I was weak. They had been laughing because they believed there would never be consequences. Now, the laughter was gone. After he left, I sat alone again, the house quiet around me. I felt no triumph, no sense of victory, only the sober weight of knowing that what I had set in motion could not be undone by regret. 3 days of silence had done what years of patience never could. It had forced attention, and attention I knew was only the beginning. The house remembered her, even when I tried not to. I noticed it most in the quiet moments, the spaces between sounds, where memory had room to surface. The indentation on the couch cushion where she always sat. The small scratch on the dining table from the night she dropped a plate and laughed at herself. The faint lavender scent that still clung to one of her scarves in the hall closet. I had lived alone long enough that the ache had softened, but it never disappeared. Grief doesn't leave. It rearranges itself around you and waits. That morning, I found myself standing in the living room, holding her reading glasses again. The same ones my daughter-in-law had mocked. The same ones 5 million strangers had laughed at without knowing what they were. They were never meant to be fashionable. Eleanor chose them because they were comfortable, practical. She cared more about whether something worked than how it looked. That was her way, quietly intentional. She would have hated the video. Not because it embarrassed me, but because it revealed something ugly about the people who made it. Eleanor believed that cruelty didn't come from strength. It came from insecurity. And insecurity, when rewarded, only grows bolder. I sat down with the glasses resting in my palm and let myself think back to a conversation we had years ago, before illness entered our vocabulary and before the word legacy felt so heavy. It was a late evening. We were both tired, paperwork spread across the table, the kind of documents people put off until life forces them to be responsible. We were talking about the future in vague terms, trying to be practical without being morbid. What happens if he changes? She asked suddenly. I looked up from the papers, confused. Our son? She nodded. People change when comfort becomes expected. I laughed it off then. Told her we'd raised him right. That values stick. That love is enough. She didn't argue. She rarely did. She just leaned back in her chair and studied me the way she did when she was trying to decide how honest to be. Love without boundaries isn't love, she said quietly. It's permission. I remember feeling uncomfortable, defensive. I didn't want to imagine a future where our son would need limits imposed by his own parents. It felt pessimistic, cold. But Eleanor wasn't cold. She was clear. She talked about families she'd seen fracture over entitlement, about children who confused support with obligation, about how silence can sometimes feel like kindness while it quietly teaches the wrong lesson. We should prepare, she said. Not because we expect the worst, because we respect ourselves enough to protect what matters. That sentence stayed with me long after the conversation ended. At the time, I agreed to things in theory. I signed where she pointed. I nodded when she explained. But in my heart, I believed I would never have to act on any of it. I believed example would be enough. Now, sitting alone with her glasses in my hand, I understood what she had been trying to teach me. She wasn't preparing for betrayal. She was preparing for disappointment. There's a difference. Disappointment assumes love still exists even when behavior falters. Betrayal assumes malice. Eleanor never thought our son was malicious. She worried he might become careless, entitled, blind to the impact of his choices. And she worried that I would stay quiet too long. She had known me well. I had always believed that patience was a virtue, especially in families. That time softened edges. That speaking up too soon risked pushing people away. I thought restraint was wisdom. What I failed to see was how restraint unaccompanied by boundaries becomes invisibility. The video had not created disrespect. It had exposed it. And my silence over the years had given it room to grow. That realization hurt more than any comment ever could. I stood and walked slowly through the house, letting memory guide me. In the bedroom, her side of the dresser still held a few items I never moved. In the kitchen, the drawer where she kept her favorite spoon still opened with a slight squeak. She would have been furious with my daughter-in-law, yes, but not for the reasons people might assume, not because of pride or image. She would have been furious because mocking an older person for simplicity revealed a shallow understanding of value. Because humiliating family for attention betrayed something sacred. And she would have been furious with me too, for waiting. I could hear her voice as clearly as if she were standing beside me. How long were you planning to let this go on? That question settled heavily in my chest. I realized then why the pain from the video had cut so deeply. It wasn't just about me. It was about her. About the life we built on quiet dignity. About the values we lived by without announcing them. Those glasses weren't sad. They were loved. Mocking them wasn't just mocking an old man. It was mocking a life lived with intention. When I returned to the living room, my phone buzzed softly. A message, brief, confirming what I already felt. Another step completed. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt resolve. This wasn't about punishing my son or his wife. It was about honoring a promise I had made even if I hadn't realized it at the time. A promise to protect what Eleanor and I believed mattered more than appearances. I sat down again and let the weight of it all settle. For the first time since the video went viral, I understood why I didn't feel guilty. Guilt comes from acting against your values. What I was doing now aligned with them, even if it hurt. I hadn't reacted out of pride. I hadn't lashed out in anger. I hadn't sought revenge or applause. I had responded deliberately, guided by principles that existed long before humiliation forced my hand. That mattered. As the afternoon light shifted across the room, I thought about how easily people misunderstand quiet strength. How often restraint is mistaken for weakness. How rarely anyone considers that silence might be a choice rather than an inability to speak. Eleanor understood that. She understood that love sometimes requires discomfort. That accountability isn't cruelty. That boundaries are not walls meant to shut people out, but lines meant to show where respect begins. I wished she were here to see what was unfolding. Not because she would enjoy it, but because she would understand it. She would tell me that standing up late was better than never standing at all. That correcting course, even at 70, still counted. As evening approached, I felt a subtle shift inside myself. A sense that something important had already happened, even if the world outside hadn't caught up yet. The call I had made, the mechanisms set in motion, the silence that followed. All of it was part of a lesson that was no longer theoretical. The consequences were no longer hidden. They were on their way. And as I set Eleanor's glasses back on the side table, I understood something with painful clarity. What we built together was never about control. It was about protecting what mattered when we were gone. And now finally, I was doing exactly that. The first sign that something was wrong didn't come from my son or his wife. It came from a quiet interruption in a routine that had always run smoothly. I was standing in line at a small office downtown, the kind of place you visit only when something requires paperwork and patience. The clerk typed, frowned slightly, then typed again. She glanced at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen. "I'm sorry," she said. "This isn't going through the way it usually does." I nodded. "That's all right." She tried again. Same result. Her tone shifted from casual to careful. "It looks like there's been a change," she said. "You may want to check with the other party involved." I thanked her and stepped aside, the exchange brief enough that no one else noticed. But I noticed. I felt it immediately, the subtle certainty settling in my chest. The call had reached its first destination. Nothing dramatic happened after that. No phone rang. No emails arrived. The city outside continued its rhythm. Cars moved. People hurried past. Life didn't pause to acknowledge the shift. That was how I knew it was real. Later that afternoon, my son called. His voice was controlled, but there was an edge to it now, a tension that hadn't been there before. "Hey, Dad," he said. "Quick question. You wouldn't happen to know why something we were counting on suddenly isn't—" I leaned back in my chair, keeping my voice even. "I'm not sure what you mean." There was a brief silence, the kind people leave when they're deciding how much to reveal. "Something we assumed was locked in," he said. "It's not anymore. Things change," I replied. He exhaled sharply. "Yeah, that's what they said. They, not her, not him. An invisible authority he couldn't argue with. We ended the call politely. No accusations, no explanations. But the tone had shifted. He wasn't confident anymore. He was unsettled. That night I checked my phone and saw that my daughter-in-law had gone quiet online. Not entirely silent, but different. The constant stream of posts slowed. The humor sharpened into something defensive. She laughed less. She explained more. Confidence, I had learned, doesn't explain itself. The next morning brought a second sign. This one arrived indirectly through a mutual acquaintance who called to ask a vague question. He didn't say much, just enough to confirm that something expected hadn't materialized, that assumptions were being challenged, that people were suddenly careful with their words. I listened. I thanked him. I said nothing else. By midday, my daughter-in-law had deleted another post. No announcement, no dramatic exit. Just gone. A small thing perhaps, but telling. She could feel it now. Fear rarely arrives all at once. It seeps in around the edges, disguised as irritation, confusion, denial. It takes time for people to admit what their instincts already know. That afternoon, my son texted again. "Do you have a minute?" I waited before responding. Not to punish him, to listen to myself. I remembered how quickly he had dismissed my pain days earlier, how easily he had aligned himself with mockery, how certain he had sounded. Now, uncertainty had replaced that certainty, and with it came questions. I replied simply. Later. He didn't press. That evening, my daughter-in-law posted a video that wasn't meant to be funny. It was framed as reflection, but it lacked humility. She talked about people turning on you, about how success attracts negativity, about staying strong when others try to drag you down. She never mentioned me. She didn't need to. The comments were different this time. Some were supportive, yes, but others asked uncomfortable questions. A few mentioned the earlier video, wondering if it had gone too far. She ignored those. I watched the video without sound and felt a familiar weight in my chest. Not satisfaction, not pleasure, sadness. This wasn't a game I wanted to win. This wasn't about watching someone fall. This was about watching consequences teach lessons I had failed to teach earlier. I thought about intervening, about calling my son and explaining everything, about easing the blow now that it had begun. I didn't. Eleanor's voice echoed in my mind, steady and certain. Let it teach. The second consequence arrived the next day. This one was harder to ignore. My son showed up at my house without calling first. He stood on the porch longer than necessary before knocking, his posture unfamiliar. Less relaxed, more guarded. When I opened the door, he looked relieved and frustrated at the same time. "We need to talk," he said. I stepped aside and let him in. He paced the living room while he spoke, words spilling out faster than usual. He talked about things not lining up, about plans unraveling, about people who had been dependable suddenly becoming cautious. "This doesn't make sense," he said. "It's like the ground shifted overnight." I listened quietly. He stopped pacing and turned to me. "You know something, don't you?" I met his gaze calmly. "I know that choices don't disappear just because we ignore them." His jaw tightened. "This feels targeted." "It feels new," I said. "That doesn't mean it is." He stared at me, searching for something. Confirmation, denial, reassurance. I offered none. He left shortly after, more unsettled than when he arrived. That night, my daughter-in-law called me directly for the first time since the video. Her voice was polite, carefully measured. "I just wanted to check in," she said. "There's been some confusion lately." I could hear the strain beneath her composure. "I see," I replied. She hesitated. "We were wondering if you might know why certain things are suddenly more complicated." "Complicated how?" I asked gently. Another pause, longer this time. "Well," she said, "it just feels like things are being withheld." "Withheld," I repeated. "Yes," she said. Unfairly, I considered my words carefully. Fairness depends on the terms everyone agreed to. She didn't respond right away. "I don't understand," she said finally. I believe that I replied. The line went quiet. For the first time since this began, they weren't laughing. They weren't posting. They weren't dismissing. They were afraid. Not because of me, but because the illusion they had lived inside was cracking. The belief that comfort was permanent, that respect was optional, that actions didn't echo. I sat alone that night, the house quiet around me, and felt the weight of what was happening settle deeper into my bones. I didn't feel powerful. I felt old. Old enough to know that this was the cost of waiting too long to speak. Old enough to understand that love without boundaries invites contempt. Old enough to accept that some lessons arrive late and land hard. As I prepared for bed, I glanced once more at my phone. No new messages, no updates, just silence. But it was different now. This silence wasn't neglect. It was attention. And I knew with a certainty that brought me no comfort at all that this was only the beginning. The laughter stopped before the questions began. I noticed it first, in the way my name was spoken. Not casually, not dismissively, carefully, as if it now carried weight people hadn't realized was there before. When my son mentioned me, his tone had changed. When my daughter-in-law referred to me at all, it was with restraint, her words chosen the way people choose language when they are no longer sure of the rules. Mockery had given way to caution. That alone told me more than any apology ever could. My son came over one afternoon without calling, his expression tight, with frustration he was trying unsuccessfully to mask. He didn't sit right away. He stood near the window, hands on his hips, looking out at the street as if the answers might be passing by. "Okay," he said finally, turning to face me. "I need you to be straight with me." I waited. "Things are falling apart," he said. "Stuff we relied on, stuff we planned around, and nobody will explain why." He watched my face closely, searching for a reaction. I gave him none. "You know something," he said. It wasn't a question this time. It was an accusation softened by uncertainty. "I know that actions don't disappear," I replied calmly. "They wait." His jaw tightened. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one that matters," I said. He exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair. "This doesn't feel connected to that stupid video. This feels bigger." I met his eyes then. "It is." That was all I said. He stared at me, frustration flickering into something else. Doubt, fear, the slow realization that the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as he thought. Later that evening, I saw my daughter-in-law in person for the first time since everything began. She came over with my son, smiling too brightly, her body language tight and rehearsed. She hugged me briefly, stiffly, as if physical warmth could bridge a gap that had already widened beyond touch. She avoided my eyes at first. When she finally met them, there was something different there. Not defiance, calculation. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "Well enough," I said. She nodded, lips pressed together. "It's been a strange few days, so I've noticed," I replied. She laughed softly, but the sound didn't carry. "I'm sure you have." We sat in the living room, the air thick with unspoken questions. She talked around the issue, circling it without landing anywhere. She mentioned misunderstandings, stress, outside pressures, anything but responsibility. I listened without interrupting. Finally, she said it. We were counting on certain things, she said carefully. Things that just disappeared. "Disappeared," I echoed. She shifted in her seat. "That's how it feels." "Feelings can be misleading," I said. Her smile faltered. "We didn't do anything to deserve this." There it was. I leaned back slightly. "You're certain of that?" She hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. Enough. My son watched the exchange closely, his eyes darting between us. He looked like a man realizing too late that he had misunderstood the nature of a situation entirely. "What exactly do you know?" he asked me. "I know why safeguards exist," I said. "And I know when they're triggered." His breath caught. "Safeguards?" I nodded once. "They weren't created yesterday." Silence settled over the room, heavy, pressurized. My daughter-in-law's composure cracked just slightly. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice rising. "All of this over a joke." "It was never about the joke," I replied. "Then, what?" she demanded. "Control punishment," I looked at her steadily. "Accountability?" She scoffed, but the sound lacked conviction. "You're overreacting." "I reacted very late," I said. "There's a difference." My son stood abruptly and began pacing. "So what now?" he asked. "Are you just going to sit there while everything we built collapses?" I watched him carefully. "I'm sitting here because I already built what mattered." He stopped pacing and turned to me. "That's not fair." "No," I agreed. "It isn't." The truth slipped out later that night, not from me, but from circumstance. A call my son took in the other room, a hushed conversation that grew tense, then quiet. When he returned, his face had gone pale. "They confirmed it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not temporary." I didn't ask what it was. I didn't need to. My daughter-in-law looked between us, confusion giving way to alarm. "Confirmed what?" he swallowed. "Something we assumed was guaranteed? Isn't." She turned to me slowly, realization dawning in her eyes like a storm cloud rolling in. "You did this," she said. "I didn't deny it. I didn't confirm it. I allowed it to happen," I said. "That's all." Her voice shook now. "You can't just take things away because you're offended." "I didn't take anything away," I replied. "I stopped protecting you from the consequences of your own choices." The room fell silent again. For the first time, neither of them spoke. Neither of them argued. They were too busy recalculating the world they thought they understood. Later, after they left, I sat alone in the dim light of the living room and let the quiet settle. I felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory, just the steady awareness that the truth had begun doing its work. Truth doesn't shout. It doesn't humiliate. It doesn't need witnesses. It simply stands. Over the next few days, the shift became unmistakable. Calls went unanswered. Emails were returned with careful wording. Doors that had always opened easily now required explanation. Assumptions were challenged. Expectations denied. My daughter-in-law's online presence changed again. She stopped joking entirely. Her posts became vague, defensive, tinged with bitterness. Followers noticed. Questions surfaced. Speculation grew. She tried to control the narrative, but narratives collapse when reality refuses to cooperate. My son withdrew. He stopped arguing and started thinking. I could see it in his posture, his tone, the way he hesitated before speaking. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't about me proving a point. It was about him facing one. One evening, he called me quietly. "I didn't know," he said. "I know," I replied. "That doesn't make it okay," he said. "No," I agreed. "It doesn't." He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked a question that mattered. "Is there any way to fix this?" I considered my answer carefully. "Fixing starts with understanding," I said, "not bargaining." He exhaled slowly. "And if we understand, then we talk," I replied. After I hung up, I sat by the window and watched the streetlights flicker on one by one. The world outside moved forward, indifferent to personal reckonings and moral lessons. Inside me, there was no anger left, only resolve. They thought they were losing control. They didn't realize they had never had it. And now, finally, the truth was speaking for itself. The invitation arrived without ceremony, tucked into my mailbox like any other piece of mail. Cream-colored envelope, formal lettering, my son's name and his wife's printed neatly at the top, followed by the details of an event they clearly wanted to feel impressive. A celebration, an anniversary, a gathering meant to reassure the world that everything was still intact. I held the card for a long moment before opening it. They wanted me there. That alone told me how desperate things had become. I didn't respond right away. I placed the invitation on the kitchen counter and went about my day as usual. Grocery shopping, a short walk, a quiet lunch, eaten alone. But the card stayed in my mind, heavy with implication. This wasn't reconciliation. It was theater. They wanted witnesses. They wanted optics. They wanted a version of reality where everything was still fine, where respect could be assumed without being earned, where the consequences creeping into their lives could be drowned out by music and polite applause. And they wanted me to play my part. That evening, my son called. "We're having a small celebration," he said, his voice careful. "Nothing big, just family, friends." I waited. "It would mean a lot if you came," he added. "To who?" I asked. He hesitated. "To us?" I considered my answer. "I'll be there," I said. Relief washed over his voice, immediate and unmistakable. "Thank you," he said quickly. That really means something." I ended the call without elaborating. They mistook my agreement for forgiveness, or weakness, or relief. They had no idea what they had invited into the room. The days leading up to the event passed quietly. My daughter-in-law's online presence grew more controlled, more calculated. She posted about gratitude, about growth, about learning lessons. She never mentioned me directly, but I was there in every carefully chosen word. My son grew quieter, less defensive. He didn't call to argue anymore. He called to ask questions he should have asked years ago. I answered what I could. The night before the event, I stood in my bedroom looking at my reflection in the mirror. Same simple suit, same unremarkable shoes, same reading glasses. I didn't change a thing. If they wanted a performance, they would be disappointed. The venue was expensive, tastefully so. Everything about it spoke of effort and image. Soft lighting, polished floors, carefully arranged centerpieces, the kind of place where nothing is accidental. When I arrived, conversations paused briefly. I felt it, the subtle shift in attention, the quiet awareness moving through the room. As people recognized me, recognized my role in the family drama they sensed but didn't fully understand. My daughter-in-law spotted me immediately. Her smile tightened, then widened. She approached with practiced warmth, hugging me lightly, careful not to linger. "I'm so glad you came," she said. "So am I," I replied. My son followed close behind, his expression unreadable. He shook my hand instead of hugging me, as if unsure what was appropriate now. "Thanks for coming, Dad," he said. I nodded. The evening unfolded predictably at first. Drinks, small talk, compliments exchanged like currency. Laughter that sounded a little too loud, a little too forced. I sat quietly observing. I noticed how often my daughter-in-law checked her phone, how she scanned the room, measuring reactions, how my son hovered near her, attentive, anxious. They were both waiting for something. They didn't know what. At a certain point, my son tapped his glass and called for attention. The room quieted. He spoke about love, about partnership, about overcoming challenges together. The words were polished familiar. Then my daughter-in-law took the microphone. She spoke about resilience, about learning to ignore negativity, about staying strong when people misunderstand you. Her eyes flicked toward me briefly, then away. Applause followed. Polite, automatic. That was when I stood. The movement was subtle, but it drew attention immediately. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Conversations hushed. Eyes turned. I hadn't asked for the microphone. I didn't need it. "I won't take long," I said, my voice steady, carrying farther than I expected. The room stilled completely. "I came tonight because family matters," I continued, "and because silence can sometimes be mistaken for agreement." My daughter-in-law's smile froze. My son's face drained of color. For years, I said I believed that keeping the peace meant staying quiet, that love meant absorbing disrespect and calling it patience. I paused, letting the words settle. I was wrong. A ripple moved through the room. People leaned forward. Phones lifted discreetly. I was publicly mocked. I continued and told I deserved it. Not by strangers, but by my own family. My daughter-in-law opened her mouth to speak. I raised a hand gently. "This isn't about humiliation," I said. "It's about accountability." I turned slightly, addressing the room rather than them alone. Values don't disappear when they're inconvenient. They wait. And when they're ignored long enough, they respond in ways that feel sudden, but aren't. My son looked like he wanted the floor to open beneath him. "I didn't come tonight to argue," I said. "I came to clarify." I reached into my jacket pocket and placed a single document on the table nearest me. I didn't read from it. I didn't explain it in detail. "I made one call," I said. "Not out of anger, out of responsibility." The silence was absolute now. That call set in motion decisions that had been prepared long before this evening, I continued. Decisions meant to protect values, not egos. My daughter-in-law's composure cracked. "You can't do this here," she whispered. "I can," I replied quietly. "And I am." My son finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "Dad, please." I looked at him, then really looked at him. "This didn't start tonight," I said. "And it won't end tonight. But pretending nothing happened won't save you." I straightened, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. "Respect isn't something you perform for an audience," I said. "It's something you practice when no one is watching." I stepped back. No applause followed. No one spoke. The room held its breath, unsure what to do with the truth now sitting in the open. I turned and walked toward the exit. Behind me, I heard my daughter-in-law's voice rise sharp and panicked, my son's low and urgent. Chairs shifted, whispers erupted. I didn't look back. Outside, the night air felt cool against my face. I took a slow breath, grounding myself in the quiet beyond the noise. The performance was over. What came next would not be public. It would be real. And for the first time since this began, I knew they understood that everything had changed. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in waves, uneven and relentless, each one stripping away another illusion they had been clinging to. I felt it not through confrontation, but through absence. Missed calls, messages left unread, invitations quietly rescinded. Doors that once opened automatically now required explanations that never came. The morning after the event, my phone stayed silent. That silence told me more than any argument ever could. I went about my day the way I always did. Coffee by the window, a short walk through the neighborhood, a stop at the small hardware store where the clerk still greeted me by name and asked about the weather instead of my reputation. Life for me remained steady. For them, it was unraveling. By mid-morning, my son finally called. His voice sounded tired, stripped of the confidence and defensiveness that had defined it just days earlier. "We need to talk," he said, "about what I asked gently." He hesitated. "About everything." We met at a quiet cafe near my house, a place Eleanor and I used to visit on Sunday afternoons. Neutral ground. No audience, no performance. He arrived early and stood when he saw me as if unsure whether sitting would be appropriate. His eyes were rimmed with exhaustion. His shoulders slumped in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager, facing consequences he couldn't talk his way out of. "I didn't understand," he said, as soon as we sat down. "I really didn't." "I know," I replied. "That video," he continued, voice low, "I thought it was harmless. I thought it was just content." "And when you were asked to choose?" I asked. He swallowed. "I chose wrong." The admission didn't bring me relief. It brought sadness. "Things are collapsing," he said. "People won't return calls. Plans we counted on are gone. She's panicking. Her followers are turning on her. Sponsors pulled out overnight." He stared at the table. "I don't know how to fix this." I studied him carefully. "What do you think needs fixing?" He looked up confused. "Everything." I shook my head slowly. "That's too broad. Start smaller." He frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean this," I said. "Are you trying to restore comfort or rebuild character?" The question landed heavily between us. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quieter. "I don't know the difference anymore." That's the problem, I said. We sat in silence for a long moment. The cafe hummed around us, oblivious to the reckoning happening at our small table. She wants you to undo whatever you did, he said finally. She thinks this is punishment. It's accountability, I replied. She doesn't see it that way. I didn't expect her to, I said. But I expected more from you. He nodded, eyes glistening. I know. That was all he said. We parted without resolution. No demands, no promises. Just an understanding that something fundamental had shifted and would not be repaired quickly. That afternoon, my daughter-in-law posted one final video. Not an apology, not a reflection, a statement. She talked about betrayal, about family turning against you, about how people with power use it to silence others. Her tone was bitter now, sharp with resentment. The comments were merciless. People who had laughed days earlier now questioned her motives. Some apologized publicly for participating in the mockery. Others demanded accountability. The tide had turned, and it turned fast. She deleted the video within hours. By evening, her accounts went dark. No dramatic farewell, no explanation, just gone. The absence felt louder than anything she had posted before. 2 days later, my son came by the house again, alone this time. He stood in the doorway, uncertain. I stepped aside and let him in. She left, he said quietly. I waited. She said I didn't defend her, he continued. That I let you humiliate her. And what do you think I asked? He rubbed his hands together nervously. I think I spent too long defending the wrong things. He looked around the house at the simple furniture, the framed photos, the quiet order Eleanor had loved. I forgot what mattered, he said. I didn't respond immediately. For what it's worth, he added, I'm sorry. Not because things fell apart, because I agreed that you deserved it. The words hung in the air, heavy and sincere. I accept your apology, I said, but that doesn't mean things return to how they were. I understand, he said. He sat down heavily on the couch. Is there any way forward? There's always a way forward, I replied. But it's not the same as a way back. He nodded slowly. That night after he left, I sat alone in the living room and let the quiet surround me. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a deep, aching awareness of what had been lost and what might still be salvaged. Eleanor's photo sat on the side table, her smile unchanged by time or consequence. I imagined what she would say if she were there. She would tell me that accountability isn't cruelty, that boundaries are an act of love, that sometimes the hardest thing to do is also the most necessary. The next morning, I attended a small meeting at a community center. Folding chairs, weak coffee, earnest faces. The scholarship fund Eleanor and I had established years ago had received new applications. Young people with ambition and humility, their stories written in careful handwriting. One young woman spoke quietly about working 2 jobs while maintaining her grades. Another talked about caring for siblings while pursuing a degree. None of them asked for comfort. They asked for opportunity. I listened, and something in my chest loosened. This was the other side of consequence. Not loss, but redirection. Later that week, I received a short message from my son. I'm staying somewhere else for now, trying to figure out who I am without all the noise. I replied simply, that's a good place to start. As the days passed, the noise faded. The internet moved on as it always does. New scandals, new villains, new distractions. What remained was quieter and more durable. My relationship with my son, fragile but honest. The memory of Eleanor, steady and guiding. The understanding that dignity isn't something you defend with words, but with choices. I had lost nothing that truly belonged to me. And in the quiet aftermath, I understood something that had taken me 70 years to fully accept. Silence isn't weakness. But when silence protects cruelty, it stops being wisdom. And when you finally speak, even if your voice trembles, the truth has a way of standing on its own. I wake up now without the weight I used to carry. The house is still quiet in the mornings, but it no longer feels hollow. It feels settled, like a place that has accepted the truth of what it is. I make my coffee, sit by the window, and watch the neighborhood come alive the way I always have. Children waiting for the school bus, a dog pulling its owner down the sidewalk. Ordinary life moving forward without drama. For a long time, I thought peace meant avoiding conflict. I was wrong. Peace, I've learned, comes from alignment, from knowing that what you allow matches what you believe, from understanding that love, without boundaries, doesn't protect relationships, it erodes them. The internet moved on quickly, as it always does. A new scandal replaced the old one. New faces were dragged into the spotlight, mocked, debated, forgotten. My daughter-in-law's name disappeared from trending lists. Her accounts stayed dark. The silence she once feared became permanent. My son stayed quiet for weeks. When he finally reached out, again, it wasn't to ask for help or favors. It was to ask questions, real ones. We met for breakfast at a small diner near his new place. He looked thinner, tired, but clearer somehow, like someone who had been forced to sit with himself without distractions. "I don't recognize who I became," he said, staring at his coffee. "That happens when you outsource your values," I replied gently. He nodded. "I thought keeping everyone happy meant keeping the peace." "So did I said. He looked up at me, then eyes steady. "I don't want to live like that anymore." I believed him. Trust doesn't return all at once. It rebuilds slowly through consistency, not promises. We talk now carefully, honestly. We don't avoid hard topics. We don't rush forgiveness. We let truth do its work. Some days are easier than others. I still think about Eleanor every day. I think about how she would have handled all of this. She would have hated the public spectacle. She would have hated the pain. But she would have insisted on the lesson. Love doesn't mean silence when silence teaches the wrong thing. Her legacy lives on in ways my daughter-in-law never understood. Not in money, not in status, but in choices that ripple outward, shaping lives quietly and permanently. The scholarship fund continues to grow. I attend ceremonies, now small ones, held in community centers and modest halls. I meet students who remind me why boundaries matter. Young people who work 2 jobs, who care for family members, who don't confuse entitlement with opportunity. When they thank me, I always correct them. "This isn't charity," I say. "It's trust." They understand that. My life hasn't changed much on the surface. Same car, same house, same clothes. I still wear Eleanor's reading glasses, not out of defiance, but out of love. They remind me of who I am when no one is watching. People still underestimate me sometimes. I can see it in the way they look at my sweater, my quiet manner, my refusal to perform success. I don't correct them. I don't need to. There was a time when being mocked would have cut deeply, when silence felt safer than confrontation, when I believed that enduring disrespect, times respect was the price of keeping family close. I know better now. Respect that requires self-erasure isn't respect. It's surrender. And teaching people how to treat you isn't cruelty. It's clarity. If there's one thing I wish I had done differently, it's this: I wish I had spoken sooner. Not louder, just sooner. I wish I had trusted that boundaries don't destroy love. They reveal it. But regret doesn't undo lessons. It refines them. I don't hate my daughter-in-law. I don't celebrate her downfall. I see her now as someone who confused attention with worth and paid the price for it. That's a hard lesson, and it's hers to carry. I don't see myself as a winner in any of this. I see myself as someone who finally chose alignment over avoidance. At 70, that feels like a quiet victory. If you're listening to this, and you've ever been mocked for your simplicity, underestimated for your humility, or dismissed because you didn't perform success loudly enough, remember this. The people who laugh the loudest often stand on foundations they didn't build. Silence can be wisdom, but only until it starts protecting cruelty. And boundaries aren't walls, they're mirrors. They show people exactly who they are when they push against them. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of a moment when you had to choose between comfort and character, I'd like to hear about it. Share your thoughts in the comments. Read others' stories. You're not as alone as you think. And if you want to hear more stories like this about family dignity and the quiet strength it takes to stand up later in life, stay with me. Subscribe. These conversations matter, because sometimes the most powerful voice in the room is the one that waited until it truly needed to speak.